Hello. Today we're going to talk about the Korean conflict in about 12 minutes or less. So away we go. So Japan had annexed Korea in 1910, ruled it all the way until 1945, and of course at the end of World War II when they lost, they ceded territory, just like everywhere else around the world. Today we're going to talk not only about the Korean Peninsula, we're also going to talk about Douglas MacArthur. We're also going to talk about Kim Il-sung, who is kind of the OG of North Korea. He is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. And we're going to talk about Syngman Rhee, somebody who you probably don't know very well, but he was placed in charge of what will become South Korea. So one of the ways I always remember him is SR. His initials SR are close to SK, so you can remember that. And all of the Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un are all going to have, well, two of the three are going to have Il in their name. It makes them easier to remember because we think Il of North Korea. And away we go. A little bit better look at Kim Il-sung, who supposedly, when he was born, rainbows, flash across the sky and trumpets blare. They've got all sorts of cults of personality built up around the North Korean leaders. And Syngman Rhee, of course, who is our ally and is our friend. So this is the guy we like. Yes, it is. And away we go. So in 1948, the Republic of Korea, usually called South Korea, was established in the zone that had been occupied by the United States. When the Japanese troops surrendered, they surrendered north of the 38th parallel to the Russians. The 38th parallel runs roughly right in here, roughly about there. And in the north, they had surrendered to the Soviets. And in the south, they had surrendered, the Japanese had surrendered to the United States. So in 1948, the Republic of Korea, usually called South Korea, was established in the zone that had been occupied by the United States. So all of this is going to become South Korea. And its government is going to be headed by Syngman Rhee, the guy that you just saw on the previous page. Their government was based in Seoul, which is right up here, which was Korea's traditional capital before the split. Simultaneously, the communists formed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. Kim Il-sung is going to be in charge up here, and their capital city will newly be Pyongyang, where a lot of interesting things happen today, which is also where Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's bodies are, in Pyongyang. So soon after World War II, the United States had to cut back its forces in South Korea, and they were down to about 500 men. Now, given that China had just fallen to communism, and our containment policy had failed, and the United States hadn't done much about it, the Soviets in the region feel like it's not likely the United States is going to do much to save, this territory here, South Korea, given that it's small in relation to the country of China. Within a few days of the United States kind of paring down their troops to 500, North Korean troops sweep across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack on South Korea. The conflict would become known as the Korean War. Within a few days, North Korean troops had penetrated deep into South Korea, because there's not much resistance there. And South Korea called upon the United Nations to come and help them. That's what the United Nations was supposed to be all about, right? When the matter came to a vote in the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union wasn't there. The Soviets were actually boycotting the council in protest over the presence of nationalist China. If you remember our quick story from yesterday, when Chiang Kai-shek left and lost the civil war in China, he fled to Taiwan. The United States continues to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan as opposed to Mao's, and so in the United Nations, the Security Council's votes are still being cast by the Chinese nationalist government there. The Soviets are really torqued about that because they feel like that's completely unfair, and probably rightfully so. But anyway, the way they handle that is to boycott the Security Council at the time, which, bites them in the butt, because when South Koreans call for help, they're not there to veto the action. And so when South Korea calls, the UN votes, and with the Chiang Kai-shek Chinese vote and without a Soviet veto, the Security Council actually approves the measure, which is kind of interesting. On June 27th, in a show of military strength, President Truman orders troops stationed in Japan to support the South Koreans, but he also sent an American fleet into the waters between Taiwan and China. 16 total nations, actually, by the time it's all said and done, send about 520,000 troops to aid South Korea. About 90% of those troops were American. South Korean troops numbered an additional 590,000. The combined forces were placed under the command of General MacArthur, former World War II hero in the Pacific, as you guys already know. At first, North Korea seemed unstoppable, driving steadily to the south, where they were able to capture Seoul. After about a month of bitter conflict, the North Koreans had forced the UN and South Korean troops into a small defensive zone around the what's called the Pusan Peninsula. So here's Busan here. Usually in a lot of text it's spelled P-U-S-A-N, but anyway, by the time the North Koreans are done with their kind of aggressive actions, this is called the Pusan Peninsula, even though it's not really a full peninsula. This area is what the UN actually controlled when General MacArthur comes into the picture and begins to create a plan. MacArthur launched a counterattack with tanks, heavy artillery, fresh troops from the United States. On September 15th of 1950, his troops made an additional surprise amphibious landing behind enemy lines at a place called Incheon on Korea's west coast. Let me go back really fast. This is Incheon. Hang on, I gotta get out of there. Okay. Erase all my ink. So Incheon is right here near Seoul, and so he is going to take an amphibious landing and land back here, push up out of the Pusan Peninsula, and he's actually going to end up capturing a number of troops in this area and using those as leverage later on. Okay. Okay, so here we are. North Korea's captured Seoul, and then the UN and the South Korean forces are pushed to the Pusan Peninsula, and then MacArthur attacks. Okay, surprise amphibious landing behind enemy lines at Incheon, which I just showed you. Other troops moved north from the Pusan, which is the lines I also just drew, and trapped between the two attacking forces. About half of the North Korean troops are going to be captured there and surrender. The rest are going to flee back north across the 38th parallel. So right now, MacArthur's plan has saved his army from almost certain defeat, and the UN army is chasing the retreating North Koreans across the 38th parallel just into North Korea. And now they have to kind of decide what they're going to do, because as a UN mission, the UN is a peacekeeping mission, right? The whole idea was to protect the South Koreans. The idea was not necessarily to go on the offense. So this gets a little tricky. When the UN army chased the retreating North Korean troops across the 38th just into North Korea, they eventually are able to get as far as Pyongyang, and then the Chinese start to get nervous, because that means that the UN forces are coming fairly close to the Chinese border. So the Chinese are going to get involved. The Chinese, however, had other ideas. A communist Chinese foreign minister named Zhou Enlai, spelled Z-H-O-U, but we pronounce it Zhe, like kind of a soft J, warned that his country would not stand idly by and let Americans come to their border, meaning the Yalu River. In late November of 1950, about 300,000 Chinese troops are going to join the war on the side of the North Koreans. The Chinese wanted North Korea as a communist buffer state to protect their northeastern provinces that made up Manchuria. They also felt threatened by the American fleet that lay off their coast. The fight between North Korea and South Korea escalated into a war in which the main opponents were the Chinese Communists and the Americans. By sheer force of numbers, the Chinese drove the UN troops southward. At some points along the battlefront, the Chinese outnumbered UN forces 10-1. By early January of 1951, all the UN and South Korean troops had been pushed out of North Korea. The Chinese advanced to the south, capturing the South Korean capital of Seoul. "We face an entirely new war," declared MacArthur. For 2 years, the two sides fought bitterly to obtain strategic positions in Korean hills, but neither side was able to make really important advances. So for the next 2 years, they're going to kind of go back and forth, but stay fairly close to the 38th parallel. Right along the 38th parallel by 1951, they're really back to the 38th parallel, and they're going to go back and forth for a little while. But basically, in 1953, the demilitarized zone was established. The demilitarized zone is still in that same location today, and this is partly what it looks like, although this is kind of what it looks like in not a major installation. Last year, you watched a video called Inside North Korea where you saw like a major installation where the crossing and communication still occurs between North and South Korea, although not very much communication. So the demilitarized zone was established, and this is one of the most heavily defended areas in the world today, with U.S. troops still stationed in the DMZ and heavily fortified on the North Korean side as well. There's all sorts of shenanigans that goes on around the DMZ as well, which is kind of interesting. The North Koreans have made fake towns on their side and pumped the sounds of cities through and built these kind of facades, these like old Western, they're not old Western towns, but like what you've seen in an old Western town with these false fronts. They've created these false towns and set them up on that side and then pumped the sounds of cities to try to prove, I guess, to the South Koreans and the United States that they're growing and urbanizing or something, which is kind of ridiculous. Because if you look with binoculars, my old boss used to be along the DMZ, and he said you could look with binoculars and see there were no people and there's no traffic, but the sounds are being pumped through speakers. Kind of fun. So MacArthur's eventually going to get into trouble because he gets mad at the Chinese for getting involved here, and he says to President Truman, hey, I can take care of this whole problem. Just give me enough bombs and I'll take care of the whole Chinese coastline and we'll be good to go. The problem is that the Chinese had a mutual assistance pact with the Soviet Union, and President Truman either knew that or didn't want to risk, nuclear conflict with the Soviets at the time. So he told MacArthur, no, your job is finished. You're doing exactly what you should do. You're not going to go on the offense. And MacArthur didn't like that. He wrote letters to congressmen. He wrote letters to the media, and he went over the president's head. And the president felt like he had little choice but to fire General MacArthur because the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief, and there is a military chain of command that Douglas MacArthur was completely violating when he tried to communicate over the president's head. So he ends up getting fired. Kind of interestingly, Congress, a joint session of Congress, which is highly unusual, invites Douglas MacArthur to speak, which is kind of a slap in the face to Truman. And there he gives a speech about how old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And there was a commission set up that looked into this incident and decided that President Truman had acted the way that he should. Although it was a while before the American public viewed it that way.